This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Caleb Campbell. Caleb is a pastor at Desert Springs Bible Church in Phoenix, Arizona, and a doctoral student at Fuller Theological Seminary. His brand new book is called Disarming Leviathan, Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor, which is out now on IVP. In this book, Caleb explores how Christians can faithfully and lovingly engage with Christian nationalists, and we will be discussing this book on the show today. Caleb, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's great being here.
Hey, I'm really excited to talk to you about this. I have on my show and with our organization, we've done a lot of work on Christian nationalism, and I actually culminated in a debate that I had with Stephen Wolfe about a month ago. And then I interviewed him for my show a few weeks back, and by the time this episode comes out, that'll already be released. So we've done a lot. My audience is very familiar with Christian nationalism, and I appreciate you have a different take on this issue than a lot of people do. But before we get to the book, just tell us about yourself, your background, and your work.
Yeah, so I serve as pastor at Desert Springs Bible Church, which is a non-denominational church. I think we're 47 years old now in the suburbs, North Phoenix suburbs. I've got family, 4 kids, wife, and we live down the way from the church. Born and raised Phoenician, so been here my whole. We did 6 years in Dallas when I was a kid. My dad worked for Snap-on Tools, so they moved us out there. Then we moved. So I became a Cowboys fan because I watched them go to the Super Bowl 3 times in the 90s. Then we came back, and now I'm here.
Yeah, well, man, it's really good to meet you today, and I'm really excited to have you on the show. The book is really interesting because if you look at the way that a lot of Christians, whether they're on the right or the left, talk about Christian nationalism, it's almost always with nothing but hostility and disdain. So it's very, very heated and very, very angry, and it's almost fashionable to be critical of Christian nationalists. Like it's a way of signaling to other people that like you're a good person and the Christian nationalists are the bad people. But your book's not like that. In fact, your book is about loving Christian nationalists. So even though it might be easier for you and maybe it might sell more books to attack them, what made you want to write a book about being loving towards Christian nationalists?
So my initial reaction to the movement that I saw kind of move through my city, move through my church, move through my own relationships, that really I saw people becoming combative and using dehumanizing speech, and it's anxious all the time, outraged. It was all wrapped up in what I now refer to as American Christian nationalism. My initial response to it was to destroy it. I thought, okay, this is a heresy to destroy. And I had an experience with a person who I was sitting with for over a couple hours, and we're talking about, she was part of an organization that is a purveyor of American Christian nationalism. And so I was doing research, trying to figure out, okay, I got to, fight this thing and, slay this heresy. I remember thinking like, if I could just out Bible these people, argue that, if I could just make really good arguments about why the ideology is wrong and contrary to scripture, we'll win, when it'll be defeated, we'll go back to normal. And I was talking to this person, and she said, this statement that changed my life. She said, Pastor Caleb, politics is really important, but at the end of the day, I just want to follow Jesus. I said, oh, me too. Tell me how you met Jesus. And she said, oh, last year at a Turning Point USA rally. And I thought, oh, her entire discipleship has been inside of an organization that's propagating a view of Jesus that's contrary to scripture. It's Jesus mixed with or conflated with Christian nationalism. And it was in that moment that I felt the Spirit of God say, Caleb, you're an idiot. These people don't need an enemy to fight them. They need a missionary to reach them. And so I kind of flipped my posture in that moment and said, okay, what would it be like if I had compassion instead of derision? If I practice hospitality instead of hatred, and recognized in that season, well, that's how I met Jesus, was people practice hospitality and kindness and curiosity towards me, even though I was, ragey, arrogant, not very kind. And And so that is how the Lord used someone who I was trying to argue with to actually change my mind and say, okay, well, really all we need to do is practice the way of Jesus with the people that we disagree, just like everybody else.
And Turning Point USA is an organization that comes up a couple of times in your book. And so I know that
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of members of my audience are just here for the philosophy and they don't follow politics extremely carefully. Maybe talk about Turning Point USA, what it is, and then how did you wind up even having a meeting with someone from TPUSA?
Yeah. So Turning Point USA, they used to be, let me try to remember. I think it started in like 2014 and Charlie Kirk's the founder, and it started as like a college movement to rally college students around certain conservative ideologies politically. It was a space for college students, especially who felt like they were being attacked or marginalized by more progressive professors. That's at least how they branded, come to this group because, we're going to fight against the, progressive professors. It morphed during the Trump campaign and election and presidency into a more broad-based political activism group. By the time you get to 2020, they had merged or partnered with Jerry Falwell Jr. out of Liberty to create the Falkirk Center. So the Falkirk Center. And then when Jerry basically got busted and, exited public life, Charlie moved the organization to Phoenix. So this would have been, to my memory, I think 2020. And in June of 2020, they partnered with Dream City Church, which is a local mega church here in Phoenix, just down the street from where I live. And they hosted Trump during the shutdown. So whatever you think about the shutdown, it was just a crazy time to be having a mass gathering. And that kind of started this relationship between Turning Point and Dream City. So Turning Point has ballooned. They started, I think, in 2014, pulled in about $400,000, that kind of nonprofit size. They were at 30 million by 2020 and have easily doubled, if not tripled since then, as they started Turning Point Faith and Turning Point Action, an activist arm of their organization. And so they do massive gatherings all across the country that they'll bring in speakers like Steve Bannon, Carrie Lake, Candace Owens, folks like that. And they'll put, thousands of people in a room. They'll do it at the convention center. And a lot of it is rallying people to political activism, specifically in the lane of Christians gathering themselves together to take government power to protect and propagate their way of being in the world.
Yeah, that was an excellent description. And I do think, and you kind of alluded to this in the book a little bit too, that TPUSA has been one of the organizations that has led to the explosion of Christian nationalism in the last couple of years. And until 2020, I think everyone in the United States had a sense that 2016 was a major historical inflection point. But then everything changed with the outbreak of the pandemic in 2020. And in fact, in your book, you described that entire year as an apocalypse. So what do you mean by that? Like, what was so monumental for 2020 as it relates to Christian nationalism, which just seemed to explode after that point?
Yeah. So the language of apocalypse, sometimes people hear it and they think zombies, end of the world. And it doesn't mean the end of the world. It just means unveiled. So an apocalypse is that which was once hidden is now revealed. And and you got some of this in 2016. So it's, take 2020 loosely. But definitively in that season, the veil was off. So whether it was COVID or George Floyd or the federal election, or just a little bit outside of 2020, the riots at the Capitol building in January 6th, people in our congregation, their response to those things was unveiling. I remember thinking, most of the folks in my congregation, they're conservative folks. Excuse me. We live in the land of Barry Goldwater. There's a statue of Barry Goldwater about 10 miles down the street here. This is the land of John McCain, who was often referred to as a libertarian conservative. And so I thought, okay, so, most of these folks, they're going to They're going to vote conservative because that's what they do. But it's more of a like keep the government off our back kind of thing. What I did not think was that people would give full-throated support to power grabs by any means necessary. And 2020 unveiled not only a deep and abiding anxiety that people had, but that they would be willing to support ungodly means of use of power in order to quell their anxiety. And that was revealing to me because I thought, oh, sure, maybe 15, 20% of the folks are into that, but it was 80%. And by the end of 2020, 80% of the folks that were in our church in 2016 had left. And a lot of it was around these culture war issues. If we didn't take the militant power grab stance on a culture war issue, it was like we had betrayed the gospel. And that conflation of those issues and that posture with the Christian tradition, this level of syncretism that I saw, I just didn't see it before. And now by the end of 2020, I just saw it plain as day.
And yeah, I really do completely agree with your analysis that it's that sense of cultural and social insecurity that drive a lot of people, especially people of faith, into Christian nationalist arms. Before we move on and talk about how you think that Christians should approach Christian nationalists, I think it's really helpful for you to just define it, because it is one of those terms that, especially in popular culture, has been defined in a lot of different ways by a lot of different people. And as I was saying before, I've interacted with Stephen Wolfe a couple of times. Actually, I have a really good relationship with him, and I actually kind of like him a lot as a person and respect him as an intellectual. And one of the things that I appreciate about his articulation of Christian nationalism is that he's very careful to define what he means by that term. And oftentimes I'll see people being critical of Christian nationalism that don't actually have a definition that they anchor their understanding of that concept to. And you provide that in your book. So talk to us about that. What is exactly Christian nationalism in your view?
Yeah, so I'm approaching it missiologically. So as a missionary, and missionaries recognize that people don't just operate in ideological states. We're also tribal beings. We're also religious beings. And so I try to elevate and tease out some of those components, different than I think what Stephen Wolfe's doing. He's primarily making an ideological argument, which I appreciate, that he's making it there. I want to also focus on some of the tribalism that's part of this, as well as the effect that it has on our faith. So American Christian nationalism is three things at the same time. It is, one, a political ideology; two, a tribal identity; and three, a spiritual idolatry. So if you look at the movement as it is today, it is those three things at once. So number one, political ideology. It's the argument that Christians should rally together and take political power to protect and propagate our way of being in the world. Christians should be in charge of the state, the government, and should pursue Christian ideals. And we could talk more about that, but at its base, that's how I understand the political ideology. Number two, tribal identity. A lot of times people will use the name Christian nationalist to refer to themselves almost as an ethnicity. Especially for white folks in America, there seems to be a vacuum in most of our imaginations about our ethnic self, the group of people that we come from, because America is, hundreds, if not thousands of ethnicities coming together, not under a common king or bloodline, but under a common idea, liberal democracy. A lot of white folks are like, well, who am I? Am I American? Is that what it means? Can American serve as an ethnicity? Is a really interesting question that we still haven't answered 200 and whatever years into it. And so there are many who will use Christian nationalists to define me and my people group. Real Americans, sometimes people use, but also Christian nationalists. And it's tribal identity as a surrogate for ethnicity, which means it's a way of talking about me and my people. And there's certain taboos, there's certain origin stories, there's certain fears, food, music, insider language, all that makes up a people group. Again, thinking as a missionary, those all exist with this tribe. Number three, it is a spiritual idolatry. So American Christian nationalism, as it's currently being practiced and propagated, is conflating certain aspects of the American civil religion with certain aspects of predominantly Protestant Christianity, or you could say evangelicalism and fundamentalism mixed in there, certain aspects of it, and saying that this newly binded together thing, that's what Christianity is. I've heard the Constitution and the Declaration referred to as sacred texts or divinely inspired. That would be an example of that syncretism, the conflation of the two things. The veneration of our ancestors. If you question Thomas Jefferson's faith in a Christian nationalist group, you will be met with derision and possibly expulsion, because you can't do that. You can't disrespect the ancestors. We venerate our ancestors, which is a very religious thing to do, especially in toxic tribalism. And then there's also empire worship that's in there. This is kind of one of the ones that I think for Americans, they don't, especially if you're not super familiar with the the New Testament. But one of the things that's happening in the New Testament is a detoxification of empire worship, because it's so easy. Like you read the book of Romans, it's so easy for the Roman Christian to also conflate their faith with power of empire. And you actually get a little bit of that in Augustine. And we haven't detoxified ourselves from that as a church. Anytime that we are in the quote unquote political majority, it's very easy to have empire worship in there, where the greatness of our government or military has some kind of religious value. And you get glimpses of that in things that could be seen as benign, like a Veterans Day or a Sunday at church, where you ask people in uniform to stand and be honored in the worship gathering. There can be a lot of really honest and earnestness in that. But one of the things that does is it venerates the power of the military in the worship gathering. And we've got to be real careful, I think, that we don't mix those two things. I'm speaking because we're in between Memorial Day and 4th of July, and
it's a very patriotic time in our country.
And I lead a congregation who wants to, honor people and show honor where honor is due. And anyways, I stray into my own drama. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. It is a very fine line to walk pastorally. And I've talked to a couple of ministers about this before, and it's a very challenging position to be in when you're trying to balance, like, okay, we have the especially you look at the book of Revelation, my goodness, the anti-imperial witness of certain aspects of the New Testament, but then also the fact that America is probably the current world empire. And it's very hard to balance those two things right now. But I think you have that was a great definition of Christian nationalism, and your controlling metaphor for Christian nationalism in the book, which is also the title of your book, is Leviathan. Now, when I was looking through the IVP catalog and kind of seeing what books were coming up to review for the show, when I saw that, I immediately thought you were going to be referencing Thomas Hobbes, because he's that very famous book, Leviathan, which is essentially about the strength of a central government in order to maintain control of society. But your metaphor is actually biblically based. And I think that when we're dealing with Christian nationalism, your metaphor is much more accurate and engaging than I think any appeal to Hobbes would be. So walk us through that metaphor of Leviathan. What does it mean? Where do you draw it from? And how does it relate to Christian nationalism?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, Hobbes screwed me up. That's what really happened here. So the biblical, if I can use this phrase, in the biblical imagination, there is a way of talking about chaos evil, the powers and principalities, rulers and authorities that the Apostle Paul refers to. There's a way that they'll talk about that force, that power force, that's contrary to the ordered ways of God, in beastly language. So in Genesis chapter 3, Cain is meditating on whether he's going to murder his brother Abel, and Yahweh says, "Be careful, because sin is crouching at your door and it wants to devour you." You get there, you got an animal, predatory beast language. You just mentioned the Revelation. In the Revelation, you have a beast and a dragon, and referred to as these kind of actors, these animated beings that are seducing humans to follow the way of the beast, which is again the disorderly, chaotic, contrary to the ordered ways of God way of being in the world. In some of the Psalms and prophets, you get the Leviathan, which is this unwieldy chaos dragon that lives in the abyss. Sea monster, I think, is one of the things we might call it. And Leviathan was picked up as a metaphor for that beastly, contrary to the ordered ways of God, chaos evil that people can give themselves over to and actually become like beasts themselves. Some of the kings are referred to in beastly language, like the Pharaoh or like Nebuchadnezzar actually has a beastly moment where he acts like a beast. And these are all ways in the biblical mind of talking about what happens. Number one, talking about chaos evil, and then how we can get our hands on it and how we can actually propagate it ourselves. And American Christian nationalism is taking a good thing that God has given to us, and it's corrupting it. It's presenting as good, but it's actually corrupting. And this gets to a really kind of nuanced commentary by Gregory the Great, 6th century. Some of the early church fathers, they really picked up on the Leviathan image, and they saw in it the ability of human leaders to grasp onto that power and lead people towards a way of destruction happily, meaning everyone who's following it thinks it's a good thing. Gregory does this little line in his commentary on Job where he says that the Leviathan presents itself as righteous, it presents itself as kind, and it says, "Come to me." The other thing I love about the Leviathan imagery is some of the church fathers recognize it as multiple headed. What's the thing in the Hydra? Is that Marvel? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. Like the Hail Hydra thing, I think is
yeah. I think it is in the older
G.I.
Marvel
Joe or Marvel. Okay. So anyway, so the image of that is a multiple headed dragon or sea beast. And the Leviathan was often referred to as such because it presented above the water as different things, but underneath the water was all the same chaos evil. American Christian nationalism is not the only thing that's leading people astray. There are myriad forms of chaos evil that are seducing people to give themselves over to it. The beast takes many forms, to put it another way, in the Revelation. It's not just one thing that we reject. So if I could just reject this one expression of evil, then I'm righteous. No, there's the way of Jesus, and then there's a bunch of other aberrant paths. And the Leviathan was a useful metaphor because it presents itself in multiple ways. So the outrage that's being stirred up in American Christian nationalist circles is very similar to the outrage that's being circled and propagated in other circles that have a different political ideology, but the same spiritual force of stirring up toxic anxiety and rage.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, you talk in the book about your experience of going to a TPUSA rally, and I have absolutely no experience being inside any of these conservative organizations like this. So I want you to talk to us about that experience and how does that correspond to your understanding of Christian nationalism as a Leviathan? What did that experience reveal to you about the Leviathan-like quality of Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so in 21, I was having folks that I pastored hand me flyers in the lobby for Turning Point events, and they're saying, "Pastor Caleb, it's a revival." And I thought, okay, so I'm looking at this flyer. It's got red, white, and blue, and I think there was an eagle on it or something, and a big rally of people. And I remember thinking, that's strange that they use the word revival because this looks like a political rally. I've been to dozens of political rallies. I know what they look like. Sometimes they're at churches, but they behave in a certain way. You know, you're not pretending we're doing church. You're just using the building. And, you know, usually the pundit says, "Thank you, Pastor Jones, for this." And I'm a political advocate for this party or this policy. And we're just gathered here together as Phoenicians to talk about that. Like, that's how they behave, you know?
Yeah.
I went to the gathering with one of my elders and I was terrified to discover we were having church. They did 3 worship songs. They took an offering. They did prayer. If you want to receive Christ, slip up that hand. And then Charlie came out and proceeded to preach for 50 minutes. He had a Bible. The Word of God says. I mean, that's how he opened. That's how I open.
Right.
Like, I remember sitting there going like, he's doing preaching. That's my job. Like, I know what this is. And what was very disturbing about it was, we're singing songs about elevating Jesus and there's Americana all over the place. Again, that syncretism, right? And Americana is woven into the worship. And then in the sermon, what Charlie did was he would use biblical texts as a launch pad to tell you revisionist history about, Benedict Arnold or something. And then the direct application of the quote unquote Bible lesson for the day was so that we would go take over the school board in the local towns. And if I want to be clear, if you want to be on the school board, that's great. If you say John 3:16 says I have to take over the school board, you're doing violence to the Bible.
Yes.
Right. It's using the scripture as a proof text for my political ends. And that's pastoral malpractice. It's not only that, it's dangerous because people are walking around thinking God told me to do this. And so I must do it by any means necessary. And the reason why I like the Leviathan metaphor is here's this room full of people, some of whom I pastored at the time. And I've been to dozens of these events since then, including one for only pastors, which was a trip. I went to their pastor summit. And I'm watching, and the people that I meet, the thousands of people in the room, they're doing this in earnest. They are having a religious experience. They are waving their hands saying amen, hallelujah, and they think it's the real McCoy. And the reason why the Leviathan metaphor works is because Leviathan works by means of seduction, never by means of, it never presents itself as evil. And the people on the stage that are purveyors of American Christian nationalism are stoking fear of ethnic erasure. They're stoking anxiety of the future. They're stoking outrage against the other, whoever the other is, the left, the immigrant, whatever, the wealthy. And then they're promising to meet those deep needs through means of a power grab. And so it's from where I sit, the people who are following this movement are doing so in earnest, and the people who are propagating it are doing so, and they're gaining power, and they're gaining money, and they're gaining influence, and they're using religious rhetoric and icons and stories in order to do that. It seems like a Leviathan move to me.
Yeah. What are some of the consequences of that for both the church and the country at large?
Well, I am but a mere parson in Phoenix, Arizona, so I can't speak to the entire country, but I could give you a couple of guesses. I know what it's done in the church is it's ripped churches apart. It's ripped families apart. It ripped our church apart. I have seen countless churches go through splits over this in my city. I've watched as people have sorted themselves into churches, and their number one question is not their pastor's theology of baptism or the end times, or if they're Arminian or Calvinist or whatever it is. I mean, these are the old questions, right?
Yeah, all the things.
Fruit of this, practice, spiritual gifts, whatever. I used to get that question sometimes. Now the question is, where are you at on this culture war issue? And where are you at with, taking the government back? I mean, I've had people visit our church. They're there for a couple of weeks and they write an email and they're like, we're leaving. We came here. We like the music or whatever, but we don't like your politics. And I'm like, what politics?
Right, yeah.
What are you talking about? Like you were here for 2 weeks. Well, because they're looking for us to do what they're seeing on TV with some of these pastors who are putting on the red hat and they're going hard on the paint and their sermons are an hour-long rant about the libs or whoever it might be.
Yeah.
And because we're not doing that, that's why we're out. And I've seen families who are having intergenerational conflict because of this. I mean, the number one pastoral question I get now is, Pastor Caleb, what do I do with my Aunt Betty? What do I do with my cousin Steve? What do I do with my daughter? We're like almost on not speaking terms because every time we get together, they're yelling and screaming about something that they're all riled up about that I don't even know exists. Lizard people running the government, the mob storming the border or something. Like, I'm looking around and things seem to be okay. They're acting like the house is on fire and they're screaming about it. What do I do? And so that's the effect in her personally. I mean, for me, I have over 300 broken relationships I could call to memory by name, which I did as part of my therapy. uh, and they're just broken now over stuff like this.
Yeah. Well, and this is why I think your book is so important, because you do look at engaging people like this from the lens of a missionary. So we have to be actively missional towards these people. I think before we can really dive into your method for doing that, there are two more questions I have. The first one has to do with someone that you just mentioned, and that is kind of the archetypal Christian nationalist who in your book you refer to as Aunt Betty. Now, I got to in case there are people in my church that don't know that I have podcasts like this, and there are people at my church that I love very deeply that fit this character very, very closely. So to walk us through who is this Aunt Betty archetype that you describe as kind of the prototypical Christian nationalist?
Yeah. So she's an amalgamation of a handful of folks that I've ministered to over the years. And the Aunt Betty who I meet at these rallies all the time is in earnest. She's got an American flag Bible cover. She's got Lee Greenwood's Proud to Be an American on repeat on her compact disc player sitting next to her recliner, right? She's got Newsmax blasting on the TV. She's got a commemorative plate of Washington at Concord, hanging on the wall. And she loves America. On Memorial Day, she goes to the Veterans Cemetery and puts the flags in the ground. And on 4th of July, she loves to celebrate and loves the fireworks displays. When she's at the cafe and she sees people in uniform, she always buys them their breakfast. And she has grown up for 55, 60 years hearing pastors on Veterans Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July conflate God bless the USA with for God so loved the world. And believes that because she's heard it from her pastors for many years. She's heard it from trusted figures like Jerry Falwell Sr. or Franklin Graham. She subscribes to Franklin Graham's newsletter. James Dobson was really helpful for her raising her kids. And now she's picking up on this stuff from people who are, promoting American Christian nationalism, and it fits right into her discipleship. And she doesn't think she's doing anything new. This is just normal. This is what we've been doing since the 1970s, trying to help make America righteous, make America, love God. She really wants her neighbors to love Jesus. She really wants to be in a community that honors God. She wants God to bless her land. At the same time, she's growing increasingly anxious about the pluralism that she's seeing growing in her community. She went to the grocery store the other day and they didn't speak English, and that's freaking her out. They just demoed some of the houses down the street to put in a parking garage, and so she's real sad about that. And when she goes to some of these rallies or she tunes in on YouTube, they're naming those things as an effect of America giving up on its principles. And so she sees the effect and she hears the interpretation. And so she's ready to cut a check. And she's now listening to this because it's bringing her some level of security and peace 5, 6, 7 hours a day. So then she shows up to the 12-year-old's birthday party and she's in an anxious, outraged state because she forgot what she told me when I was a teenager watching too much trash on TV. Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
She forgot the discipleship that she did to me, that if you're being made ragey because of a message, violence in a movie, whatever it might be, just turn it off. And instead has found a peace in it. Excuse me. And so Aunt Betty is not a monster. She's not an idiot. She's not, easily swayed. She's operating in earnest in a culture that she's grown up in and listening to the same leaders that she's been listening to since the 80s. And the reason why I used Aunt Betty is it's so easy to go to the 30-year-old dude that looks like me with, pseudo military garb and an AR-15, and that's the one who's the center of American Christian nationalism. I can tell you that is a real concern. Like acts of violence is a very real concern. I live down the street from the FBI building. When the Mar-a-Lago resort was raided by the FBI, there were 40 people marching up and down my sidewalk with paramilitary guard ready to storm the FBI building. And they all had AR-15s and handguns. So yeah, that's a very real thing. Yeah. Like I'm not trying to say, oh, everyone's Aunt Betty. But the core of this movement is funded and staffed by people who, like Aunt Betty, are operating in earnest. They really do think that this is the way that Jesus wants for them. And so the way back must not be through argumentation and direct, power grabs. It's got to be another way.
Yeah, and you talk in the book about how your vision of like being a missionary to these people is that you should want to gently restore these people back to the faith. And the phrase that you use is table setting, not table flipping. So talk to us about how that might help somebody like Aunt Betty see the irrationality of their beliefs.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and this method works for everybody. It worked for me too. So the anchor text for me has been Galatians 6:1-2. If anyone is caught up in a transgression or an evil, you who are spiritually mature seek to restore that person gently. So restoration, if they're caught up in it, restoration is the goal. And how do we do it? Gently. And then the next line, watch out for your own self, lest you too be tempted. Well, tempted to do what? Well, to meet unkindness with unkindness, to meet rage with rage, right? All the temptation. So watch out for your own self, lest you too be tempted. And therefore bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And that idea of recognizing that these people that we love, our friends, our family, our coworkers, people at our church, our Sunday school teacher, they're caught up in something. And my hope is to restore them gently. And so that gentle restoration happens best at the table. So one of the things to notice about Jesus' ministry of reconciliation is everybody likes to go to the table flipping, right? Oh, look at him. He's in the temple. He's flipping the table. Yep, I get it, right? I want to do that too. But he did that once. Look at how many times he was doing the table setting. One biblical scholar said Jesus ate his way through the Gospels. He's always at table with a bunch of people with whom he fundamentally disagreed with their politics or their religious devotion and expression of it. I mean, he was at tables with people who were like zealots. One of his own disciples was a zealot who would have advocated for military overthrow of the Romans. He was at tables with tax collectors who were co-conspirators with the Romans. And his message of the kingdom, right, the good news of the kingdom of God, was proclaimed at messy tables with people who did not like each other. But he was doing something to them. He was drawing them closer to himself, and in so doing, drawing them close to each other. And so at the table of hospitality, we communicate one of the deepest needs that we have as humans is being met, namely, you belong. So when we're at table together, I'm communicating to you, I want you to be with me. You belong at this table, right? Our core needs of safety, belonging, and purpose are met when we're at a space, sharing a meal, we feel safe. We can, at least, if we're, good hosts. And we're recognizing you're welcome here. And whatever we're going to talk about today, whatever you want to talk about, you want to talk about the thing you saw on Newsmax yesterday? Okay. But we're going to do so in a safe, welcoming environment, because what I want to do is I don't want to just talk about your opinions about something you heard on the news. I want to talk about what's going on in your heart. Well, how do you feel when you hear about 25,000, immigrants storming the border and raping and pillaging? How does that make you feel? Because it's in that space that we actually see, heart connection, heart change. And so instead of trying to argue about facts and opinions, stuff that's up in the head, setting the table of hospitality gives us space to communicate heart to heart, which is the objective, which is what Jesus is always doing, by the way.
And like any missionary, you have a really great chapter in your book about how you have to prepare your heart before you can engage with somebody that way. And I got to say, I really appreciated, I think, this chapter more than any of the other ones in this book. And it's one of the reasons why I think that this book was better written by a pastor like you instead of like a biblical scholar or somebody like that, because it's just great pastoral advice for dealing with people that are different from you in any context. But what are some of the ways that we should prepare our hearts to engage with these people, knowing that it might be a contentious conversation?
Oh man.
Which I know it's not easy to do.
I got to tell you, like we just did the kind Aunt Betty thing, and I've tried to articulate her as a figure as, you know, sweet and kind of lovable, but I get it. Like if you're having engagements, conversations with people who've given themselves over to American Christian Nationalism, they say a lot of things that are just obscene and hurtful and sometimes threatening. And being around ragey people sucks. Like, no, I don't want someone raging at my 12-year-old's birthday party.
Right.
You know, I get it. I see Uncle Jim's posts on social. I get it, right? Like it sucks. But that's a me problem. my derision and my anxiety and my belittlement or temptation of belittlement, or, you know, calling them names or simply trying to dismiss them as ignorant hicks, you know, whatever it is. That's a me problem. And the most of the work that we have to do in engaging our Christian nationalist neighbor is in us. Because for any missionary, if you go into your mission field, you know, fatigued, ragey, anxious, you're going to do a lot of harm. And you're not going to represent the gospel well. And so I want to do what Jesus did, which is spend a lot of time focusing on my relationship with the Father, right? So one of the things you'll notice if you just read through the Gospels, the amount of times Jesus like went away, he's like, peace, I'm out of here. Why? Well, because he's modeling for us something that is very healthy. When we're doing the ministry, it's so taxing that if we are depleted, we're on, you know, we're edgy, we're anxious, whatever it might be, we're going to do harm, even though we want to do good. So yeah, watching out for my own self, protecting my own heart. So just a few things I think that I cover in the book. One, like make sure you're taking naps, like eating well. Like first of all, just watch out for your body, right? Notice what your body is telling you. If you're really tired, this is not the time to talk to Uncle Jim in any sort of, you know, deep heart to heart way, because it's going to be exhausting, you know? Two, checking in, like as I imagine this conversation I'm going to have with my cousin Steve, what am I feeling? Is anything going on inside of me that I need to take to the Lord? You know, derision, shame. One thing, especially for people close to us, that is different than other mission work is, do I feel familial shame? Meaning, do I feel ashamed because I'm in the same family as that person who's doing things that I hate and despise and I find disgusting? And again, that's a me problem. Sometimes we try to like fix our family shame by telling people just to shut up because we don't like what they're saying. Well, that's not healthy. Praying right before, during, and after we have a meeting with somebody. Asking other people. One of the things I know about, you know, if your listeners are familiar with like evangelical church, like mission work, there's a few of us who go and then they ask everyone else to pray. So just asking people, hey, I'm going to go talk to my Uncle Jim. Would you guys pray with me? And then I'll follow back up tomorrow and tell you how it went. And we'll just keep praying for Uncle Jim, whatever it might be. And then recognizing, and this one's key, recognizing I don't change people's hearts. All I can do is create hospitable spaces, have hospitable, curious conversations, encourage and honor the things in the other person that are honorable, and then introduce humbly subversive questions. But the Spirit of the living God is the one who does the repentance work, the change of mind and heart work. And so I want to relinquish my responsibility or my thinking that I've got responsibility to change somebody's mind. I can't change their mind. All I can do is try to connect heart to heart and show them a better way. And so reminding myself of that, like when I'm going into a meeting, I can't change Aunt Betty. I can't do it. So that brings me a little more peace knowing like, even if the conversation ends up where it started, I still did what I could do, which is be faithful in the moment.
You have a very long chapter towards the end of your book where you walk through how people can respond to Christian nationalists on an issue by issue basis, and you give some advice just for how to deal with these particular issues from that chapter. Which I know we're not going to be able to cover everything in there, but what are some of the most important issues that you think that people will come into contact with when they're engaging with Christian nationalists, and then what are ways that they can helpfully approach that? Like, what's some advice that you would offer for people that are trying to be faithful to their Christian nationalist neighbors?
Yeah. So we're in right now, as we're recording this, we're in the summer before the federal election. And so one of the issues that the volume's turned up on is election integrity. Now that may be different depending on your context. So I can only speak as a Phoenician. I know it's huge here. I think we're on our 6th lawsuit trying to get the 2020 election overturned, or maybe it's 22. Anyways, okay, so you take election integrity, because I think that'll be a spicy one for people.
Yeah.
You've got someone who's like, did you hear about the ballots? They're made out of bamboo. Or did you hear that the voting machines are actually owned by the Russians? Or did you hear that local candidate actually paid money to the mob boss to get the election stolen? Okay, whatever it is, right? Okay, so those are all facts and opinions that are coming out of this person's mouth. What I want to invite you to do, if they are a follower of Jesus and you're a follower of Jesus, instead of arguing facts and opinions right away, like, where'd you hear that? That sounds crazy. What are you talking about, bamboo ballots? I see no evidence of this. Again, now we're arguing. Instead, go heart to heart. So ask, hey, when you hear that, what are you feeling? Because when I hear that elections are insecure, I feel a profound amount of anxiety, because what happens if we don't have free and fair elections? Like, I feel an anxiety when I even think about it. What are you feeling? And that is an invitation. First, I took the first step by telling you how I'm feeling. Now, again, I didn't agree with any of the things they said. I just said, when I think about things, elections not being free and fair or whatever, not having integrity, I feel anxiety. And then you listen to them. Okay, I'm just so afraid that we're going to lose our rights, or that, evil overlords are going to take over the country. Oh, dude, that's terrifying. So I want to try to have empathy. I want to feel with them. Tell me, what are you thinking? Like, what's going on when you think through that? Well, I'm just so scared for my kids. Oh, me too. Like, I believe that we should do our very best to create a community in which our kids can grow up safe and healthy. And I'm in agreement with you. So what I've done there is connected on core values. I don't necessarily agree with whatever they're coming to the table with about the election, but I do agree we should work together to create a safe community for our kids to grow up and flourish, right? So we're anchoring ourselves together. I'm avoiding any sort of enemy language, like you're an idiot, or here's another enemy language for Christian nationalists. If you say, well, I listened to MSNBC the other day. Okay, well, now you're an enemy because that's a, leftist propaganda rag or something like that. So it's just, right. We want to get to the heart as soon as we can. And so we're going to connect over, hey, we're going to work together to create a safe space for our kids. And, I personally have been reading the teachings of Jesus, and he says things like, those who live by the sword die by the sword. And he says things like, the kings of this world lord it over people, but it shouldn't be so with us. And he says things like, Caesar's always doing Caesar stuff, but what my responsibility is to practice the fruit of the Spirit and 1 Corinthians 13 love and the way of Jesus, like between the two of us and between us and our family and our church. And so I want to try to do that. So let's say that the election's rigged, or that there's evil actors doing evil things. What do you think the way of Jesus tells us? What do you think Jesus says we should do? Because what I hear you say is you seem to be advocating for violence. And is that a Jesus thing? Help me understand that. And now we're back to the teachings of Jesus being applied to a really messy situation. So even though we don't agree with the problem, we do agree whatever the solution is, it's the way of Jesus. So let's get back to the way of Jesus. And the reason why I think that's one of the most critical moves is what Christian nationalism, American Christian nationalism does, is it says the way of Jesus is violence. Don't look at your Bible, right? Like don't read Bonhoeffer. Don't think deeply about this. Just here's a verse out of context, slap it on your sword, and let's go take over the government. And that invitation back to the way of Jesus, I think that's the key. But we won't go there unless our hearts are open to it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, you end your book on an optimistic note, just reminding the audience that God will one day come back and make all things new. We have the vision of the new heavens and new earth at the end of the book of Revelation. But in the meantime, what do you think our prospects for restraining Christian nationalism are, considering its prominent place in American politics?
Phew. Well, see, the thing is, you can't contain Leviathan. It just takes on a new form. So while, like whack-a-mole, are you familiar with that?
Oh yeah.
When I was a kid going to the birthday party at the pizza place, there'd be this arcade game with like 8 holes, and a little animatronic mole would pop up, and you'd hit it with a mallet, and then over on the other side, another one would pop up. And Leviathan is like whack-a-mole. It just the minute that American Christian nationalism dies down, there'll be some new version of an outrage-inducing, anxiety-inducing force that's contrary to the ordered ways of God. However, to your question, I'll give one as a pastor and one as a citizen. One as a pastor. This thing, it didn't start last week. It's been growing in the American ethos and DNA for decades, if not centuries. So the way out of this probably isn't in our lifetime. But it happens not through one big movement or one big leader. It will happen through 100,000 kitchen table conversations happening every year for the next decade, because the change that needs to occur is in people's hearts. Okay, so that's pastor. Civilian, healthy civic engagement. One of the reasons why American Christian nationalism has gained so much steam is because you've got a lot of Christians who have grown apathetic to civic engagement. And however you're voting, that's fine. That's one thing. But just having healthy discourse about how we're going to manage our common life together. That matters to people, especially if they're on the receiving end of something negative that we're doing together. And so government, as messy as it is, we're in it. We're part of it. We're putting tax dollars into it. Our voices, if we use them, can be used to influence some of the leaders that we have. And my invitation for Christian citizens is recognizing that your voice, that your dollars are already going to work through taxation. That's just happening. And where that goes and how that works, that we do have an invitation to speak into that. Usually that's at the local level. Federal level, I don't know how much influence we have. Sorry, that sounded defeatist. I do know this. I have found more traction at the local level because I can go meet with people. And I can say, like, we have a county recorder here who's just getting, poor guy, like just for 4 years has just been dumped on by certain political actors. And what I can do is I can say, dude, I'm sorry that's happened. Send him notes and we're praying for you and your team. I know you're really trying to do the right thing here. We can do that, right? And we can say things like, is there any way I can help? My invitation for folks who are worried about like election integrity is like, get involved. And my invitation for people who are worried about school board is serve the school. Especially if you're a Christian, if our posture first is not that of a servant, we're not doing it right. And we have an invitation to serve in these spaces. And I don't mean, run for office necessarily, but we have an invitation to serve and support people who are operating in earnest and trying to do the right thing. And usually you can know that if you meet with people at the local level.
Yeah, I think that was great. I got just a couple of final questions for
Sure.
you that are geared really more towards my libertarian audience. And I know I know that as a pastor,
I'm a Phoenician, bro. We started libertarianism.
Yeah. Well, I have no idea what your politics are. And in reality, it doesn't really matter because I've had people from all over the political and theological spectrum on my show. I just enjoy hearing what people have to say about this. But I did write an article for the Libertarian Christian Institute that I work for. I guess it was back in the fall, maybe. Yeah, I guess back in the fall of 2022. 2023. So which I feels like forever ago now. But the article was entitled Progressive Christian Nationalism. And I have Preston Sprinkle post it on his Twitter account, and it generated a little bit of controversy. But essentially what I had been doing is reviewing a lot of Stephen Wolf's work and reviewing kind of Christian nationalism in general. And I saw that if you look at the structure of Christian nationalism, that a nation should be oriented towards Christian values and the laws and customs should reflect Christian values, that same fundamental substructure is also true of progressive Christians as well. And so as a libertarian, my concern is always with political authoritarianism in general. And I see that phenomenon happening on both the left and the right. And so the argument that I made in that piece is that Christian nationalists and radical progressive Christians are really no different except for policy. They have the exact same political posture on power and how power ought to be used to better society. So I wanted to get your perspective on that. Do you see radical progressive Christianity as a threat in the same way that you would see Christian nationalism? Do you think they're a threat in different ways? Do you see that maybe Christian nationalism is worse? What do you make of that?
Well, I would say Christian nationalism is not inherently conservative.
Yeah.
It's the argument that Christians should be in charge.
Yes,
what you do with the power, that can be what we call conservative or progressive. So I think it was the 1970s, there was a movement called Black Christian nationalism. And the argument was for Black Christians to take control of government. Now, the policies that they argued for would be considered today progressive. And so I think that the problem lies not with the conservative or the progressive. It's in the nationalism part. The religious nationalism, the idea that a religious sect should be in charge of the government. That is the ideological problem. And the other thing, bro, like, you know this, I love this, that people say, oh, well, you know, we have to have Christian values. Which ones?
Right.
Because
yes.
Christians can't figure out, like, are we going to put Mennonites in charge of the Department of Defense?
Right.
Like, they're Anabaptists. They're to defund the thing, right? So I think that what's happening is people are feeling anxiety about a handful of culture war issues, and they think that if we could just take enough government power, we can fix the culture war stuff. And my response to that is, you know how the Roman Empire's culture wars were influenced by Christians? Through service, through sacrifice. And in fact, the church got real gross when it got in bed with power in the Roman Empire. And now you've got 1700 years, this side of roughly Constantine, of this weird thing where sometimes the church bears a faithful witness and sometimes it's in bed with the state and it's just a puppet of the state. And so again, back to the thing, you know, what'd you call it? Radical progressive Christianity.
Yeah.
If there are, and I don't know that that's kind of out of my field, but if they're arguing that we should take government power to protect and propagate our way of being in the world as a religious sect, that's dangerous and it mars the witness of the gospel. My appeal to a conservative and a progressive Christian is be in the same church together, model the fruit of the Spirit while you're at table, and show this dead and dying world the beauty of the gospel and the manifold wisdom of God by being nice to each other and cooking meals for each other and not losing your ever-loving minds on social media.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I did love the point that you make about that you made about putting Mennonites in charge of the Department of Defense. As a libertarian, if I was ever elected president, I would absolutely make sure that the Mennonites had control of the Department of Defense. My next question to you, you have a section in your book where you talk about conspiracy theories, and
yes,
there are a lot of very dumb versions of conspiracy theories, and Christian nationalists tend to have the dumbest, most anti-intellectual versions of those conspiracy theories. And of course, people in the media pick up on that and they use it to discredit conspiracy theories. But I think it's just true that very rich and powerful people throughout history have always kind of conspired to increase their wealth and power. And I look at, like, with the Federal Reserve, the chair of the Federal Reserve, the person who is in charge of our nation's monetary policy, made millions of dollars being a trader on Wall Street beforehand and is presumably still friends with all of those people. And so it's not that, it's not that there's some sort of like mystical force wars happening. It's just the incentives of power. And I think you can look at a lot of other organizations, and the World Economic Forum is a big one. I think it's overstated by some people, but it's just a bunch of very wealthy and successful politicians and business leaders that are trying to direct the world economy in a certain way. And I'm sure they all think that they're doing good for the planet, but it is like sort of conspiratorial in the sense that they are getting together and planning. So I wanted to get your perspective on that too. Is there a sense of, because as Christians, I do think that we have an obligation to speak truth to power. Should there be an extent to which we should be able to say, hey, it looks like these people are using their power to benefit themselves, and we should call that out without necessarily tethering it to the stigma that's often attached to the label conspiracy theory? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah. Well, your Bible tells you that wealth is really dangerous to one's own soul.
Yes.
And your Bible tells you that the military generals and the merchants of the earth have given themselves over to the beast. So I would just say, well, that's just good Bible study. Now, which person and when, we want to be careful not to do character defamation and slander, and, we don't want to accuse. So I think it's fair to say that it is very common for the rich and powerful to work together to garner more wealth and power. Great. I think where a Christian might want to take a pause is like, and it's that person because of the thing I read on the internet. Okay, well, now we're subverting courts of law and like doing character defamation. That's dangerous. Not so the speak truth to power thing. I think when there's evidence for it, we should do it. I would encourage us to look at the methods of the civil rights movement of America, which was a group of Christians peacefully resisting, attempting to speak truth to power. It was a little easier in the sense of there were laws that they could point to and politicians' statements they could point to. I think when evil hides more deeper in the system, sometimes it's harder to point at and say that's the problem. But yeah, the church should bear prophetic witness. It should do so without giving up its witness, though. My encouragement to people who are propagating what some people call conspiracy theories is, I don't think you're pushing this thing far enough. Like, what Paul calls powers, principalities, rulers, and authorities, those are always at work and they're unseen. And so that's why he invites followers of Jesus to discern the spirits, like pray that you could see. But the thing is, Paul was worried not about us being able to point it out in Rome. He was worried that Rome would influence us, that it would be infecting us, that what they're doing out there would actually be something that we would want to imbibe in. And so when we see things happening out there, I think there's time for us to bear prophetic witness. But it's also a huge caution. Are we imbibing that spirit of the age? I mean, I don't know the last time I heard a famous sermon on greed.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about sex stuff and gender stuff, and everyone seems to be riled up about that and abortion. And these are important issues. But you know how much the Bible talks about greed and flaunting wealth? I mean, Paul tells people not to wear jewelry. Like, when are we doing that? Like, so all that to say, I think as Americans, we're too easily seduced by some aspects of evil and corruption that we wink at billionaires. And we just don't seem to have a problem with it. We got huge problems with one thing, but then we look at, inordinate wealth being propagated by actors who are operating behind the scenes, probably doing things that are not good. We just kind of wink at because it's making us money.
Yeah. No, I think that was a really good answer. This is the final question I'm going to leave you with, and this, I think, is the most challenging for everyone that's critical of Christian nationalism. I see a lot of really good critiques of that political philosophy without any sort of substitute to replace it if it's ever vanquished. So,
yeah.
And this is the big one here. But in your view, what is the role of church in politics, if there is any role at all? And then from your perspective, what would be kind of the optimal political system? If it's not radical progressivism or Christian nationalism, what is it? And I know that this is the $1 million question, and the one that gets everyone angry, but I figured I'd put it to you right at the
Sure. Well, the answer to your second question is kingdom come, which is
Amen.
which is the pastor way out of that question.
Amen. I don't disagree with that answer, by the way.
I mean, dude, I am just an amateur. I really don't understand all of our options. I like liberal democracy. As a pastor, I feel so free to share my thoughts and opinions and speech. And I have peers in other places who are run by other governments, and they're not that free. So I hear a lot of conversation about like oppression. So I just don't feel it.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I won't get into comparison, but we are enjoying an insane amount of freedom.
Yeah.
As Christians. And if I can use the language of the free market of ideas, has begotten a space where Christianity can have its arguments without fear of getting stabbed to death by a soldier. And that's new in the church. I mean, I think some of the beauty that we've seen, I mean, in America, you have an insane amount of diversity of denominations because we're free to explore these different theological ideas without fear of the state intervening. I can go to any seminary I want to. I don't have to go to an underground seminary. And so I'm very appreciative of the liberal democracy we have that elevates pluralism, because it allows me and my peers, us, our brothers and sisters, to have internal theological discussions without the state messing around with it. And I really like that. I think we should honor, I think we should preserve that. If not Christian nationalism, then what? It's a great question. What posture should the church have to any government? Philippians chapter 2. Jesus did not see the power and equality that he had with God, something to be grasped onto, but rather, giving it up, he took on the form of a servant. He washed feet. He sat at the last seat at the table. So I think that the church should seek to serve the community that they're in. Sometimes that means speaking truth to power, like the prophet Nathan did to David. A lot of times that means, scrubbing the bleachers at your local high school and everywhere in between. I think for Christians who want to serve in government, and each Christian needs to make up their own mind on their own convictions, but I've pastored people who've served in government or run for office. And my pastoral encouragement is run for office and don't give up your witness. Like, if you can do that, go for it. But truly seek to be what we call a civil servant. Don't give your allegiance to the elephant or the donkey. Don't become the dragon. Serve like the lamb. And if that means you serve one term, then that means you serve one term, because the ends are in God's hands. We are responsible for the way that we live in the means of trying to pursue that end.
Yeah, Caleb, that was a beautiful answer, man. Great way to end it. Well, again, I've been talking to Caleb Campbell today. His new book is called Disarming Leviathan, Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor. By the time this episode's released, that book will be out on IVP Press. So I highly recommend everybody check that out. Before I let you go, Caleb, where can people find your work and follow you?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So disarmingleviathan.com, and we're on all the major platforms. Got a podcast called Disarming Leviathan, and also, if you're ever in Phoenix, just look me up.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.